All right. All right. Good morning to each and every one of you watching. It is my absolute pleasure and privilege to be with you this morning. If you are watching us right now, welcome to Ubuma Leadership in partnership with Constitution Hill's Black Men's Imbizo. And it is our absolute pleasure to be here today. And we have an extraordinary panel that we are excited to have. So what I'll ask you to do is to share this link, share it with your friends, share it with those watching. So and let everyone know that we're about to begin. In the comment section, I have my phone just underneath here, and I'm looking at it right now. And you can put in a comment or a question, and I will send it to our imminent panel. And today we are so excited to be joined by Professor Maloselanga, Dr. Bababuntu, Afura Khan, Pupu Muslaba, and I'll give you an introduction of who they are very, very soon. So we are live on the Constitution Hill Facebook page, and what you can do is you can share the link on your statuses on your different social media, and we are just so excited to have you. So I'm just going to give a few minutes for each and every person watching to share the link, to invite their friends and their friends' friends, as we're about to start this conversation. All of us are here to learn. I'm excited to learn from these men, and I have great respect for them, for what they do, for who they are, and for the work that they bring about. So it's very exciting for us to have them here, and it's just a great privilege and a great joy. So we are here, and we are ready to fly. And what I want to do is simply say thank you first and foremost to Constitution Hill. I want to say thank you to them for their partnership. I also want to thank each and every one of the speakers here, and all of the people who have been involved in making this happen. Really, we are grateful, and we are excited to see what will come out of this event, what will come out of the conversation that we are having. So please do share the link, send it to your friends, send it to your friends' friends, and it's going to be really an amazing conversation. It's going to be an amazing conversation, and we are just grateful to have each and every one of the speakers here. So very quickly, as we begin, we are grateful and excited to have the different speakers here. The Black Men's Imbizo was founded, I think 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, and its goal was to have conversations around masculinity, around manhood, around what it means to be a man in this country. And it is not a piece of information, it is not a piece of news, the lived experience of our country. And like I said, we're here for a conversation, but what we realized, myself, my colleagues, my partners, and our partners, some of whom are here, is that there needed to be a work done within the man in order for our society to improve, in order for the lived experience of women to improve. And today we are meeting for the first time online. It's our first online Imbizo. And we are hoping that the conversations will be as rich and as effective. Usually our Imbizos are a full day event, but today, for the first time, we're going to be having them online in these very different circumstances. And we're coming around to discuss the mind of the man. And fundamentally, the Imbizo realizes that for men to change, for our society to be liberated, the shackles in the minds of men must certainly fall and men must be liberated. To just preface the conversation a little more before we go into our questions, there are often discussions about how South Africa is a country with two realities, two nations, the rich and the poor, the educated and the uneducated, the black and the white. But perhaps the most common and pervasive reality in our South Africa is that there are two nations, for men and for women. If you are born male in this country, the societal norms, the culture confers upon you the right to be an oppressor. If you're female, it might impose upon you the yoke to be oppressed. And we want to rid ourselves of this and create a society that is antithetical to that which preceded, but also one that has a different set of values. If we were together, we would be having this conversation at Cornhill. And one of the values of our constitution is non-sexism. And we're hoping that together, as black men, as African men, as South Africans, as citizens, as humans, we'll be able to have this conversation. So I'm joined, like I said, by Dr. Bababuntu, who works with Ibokusini Solutions, but also has a particular program called Shabaka, and who has been dealing with issues around men and developing the black man for over a decade, a man who I have tremendous respect for. We are also joined by the poet, Afura Khan, who has a brilliant chapbook that he has written called The Broken Men. And that chapbook really in verse explains many of the realities that are experienced by men and how men experience the world. We are also joined by Professor Malose Langa, and he is a brilliant professor that's particularly distinguished. But what particularly brought him to my attention personally was his book, Becoming Men. And it looked at black masculinity in the South African township. And you can get the book at Exclusive Books. It's called Becoming Men, looking at black masculinity in townships. And he's joining us today, and his eminent mind is here. And we also have Pupu Muslaba, who is a football coach, but he's here in his capacity as one of our Black Men's Imbizo champions. So what is extraordinary about this panel is that each and every person, each and every man here is heavily invested in the development of the black man. Each and every man is not just here to give a soundbite or a talk, but each and every day is actually working on this particular project of developing the black man, uprooting patriarchy, giving our society a manhood that is safe, a manhood that values dignity and values our women. So to get directly to the subject of our conversation, Dr. Bababuntu, I know you well, so I don't mind putting you on the spot. If you can tell me, when it comes to the mind of the black man, you've spoken to thousands of men over the last 10 years and more. Where do we start? Where do we start the conversation when seeking to understand the mind of a man?
Thank you so much, Brother Mike, and also to Ubuma Leadership for putting together this platform and presencing a very important and sometimes complex and slightly challenging conversation as well. This is obviously something we feel we wish we didn't really even have to discuss, but unfortunately, the reality is that we need to. So in my work, actually so Shabaka has existed for about 10, 11 years, but we have been doing this work, I could say, for about 30 years now. And I've had a lot of dialogues, a lot of conversations with African men in South Africa, but also in other countries. And I think there's many places we need to start. And I think maybe this is what overwhelms us, that we need to do so many things at the same time. But I think we need to start with understanding the brokenness that has been designed and affected how we feel and how we act and what we think about ourselves as African men. And I find that one thing that so many of us have in common that we normally don't talk about is that we have a deep sense of invalidation. and it can come out as low self-esteem, it can come out as brutality, it can come out as clowning, it can come out in so many different ways. But deep at the center of, I would say, at least on my experience, I haven't talked to all African men in the world, but from my experience, there is a huge question that sits at our root, the core of us. What does it mean to be an African man? It seems like we think that there is a specific box we need to fit into. And since so many of us don't experience that we fit into it, we try to negotiate how we deal with it by masking something, by performing something, by doing something that we get applauses, meaning responses, and that seems to work in society, which often is problematic. Sometimes it's violent, and sometimes even is violent against ourselves. So we struggle with, are we supposed to fit into a box? Can we just be the men we want to be and feel we should be? But we seem to think that there's a box we need to fit into. And since many of us feel very invalidated, which could be fatherlessness, which could be that society doesn't seem to expect much from the African man, which also that we doubt and we don't often see ourselves as potentially successful, whatever that means, men. There's something about our validation that sits very wrongly for many of us.
You know, Baba, you said something that was incredibly powerful there. You mentioned about how there is a box that men feel they have to fit into. And that was what I found extraordinary when we had the Imbizo. And I remember one of the first meetings we had when starting was with you, is that the nature of patriarchy is not just that it oppresses all who are other, but even the men who are called to inhabit this patriarchal identity are themselves expressed. And you and I both know in working with men, when we come into spaces, the pressure they feel under these notions of identity. So here, I want to ask Professor Langa, when you looked at these ideas of Black masculinity in the township, particularly in your experience, what is the root? Where do these ideas come from? You know, is it just religion? Is it just cultural? What is the root of this masculinity that is imposed on many men and that we see playing out in extreme forms of violence, aggression, and different kind of atrocities against women?
Thanks, Mike, and fellow panelists, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this very important conversation. And obviously, I'm going to build on what Baba Buntu has just mentioned. And obviously, I mean, there's no way we can talk about Black men or African men without taking the history into account. Even the so-called townships, these are settings that we need to, I guess, sort of unpack, because they're founded on a particular history. So we must not normalize townships as normal spaces where people sort of live. They were made with a particular intention, and they're a product of a particular system. So that has to be taken into account and has to be sort of normalized, because today townships are spoken as if these are normal living conditions, spaces under which sort of people live. And obviously here, what I want to get into is the fact that, I mean, in Africa, colonialism is a reality that we still feel till to date. And in South Africa, in addition to colonialism, which had an apartheid sort of element, it made things sort of even more worse. So in terms of my work with what Baba Buntu has said about a sense of validation, they need to be validated. They need to mask certain feelings. They need to perform, I guess, certain acts, for you to show that you're a man. It does say something about this sense of manhood. So obviously I'll make four comments that basically being a man, it means you must stop being a human. You must stop being a human being. So the whole process of becoming a man, which is what I'm saying in the book, basically you become dehumanized. You stop being like a human being. And for me, there's like no conversations that how then do we begin to humanize like men for them to be like human beings who are of a male in terms of like gender, because the whole process of becoming a man, just repeating myself, is that it is very dehumanizing. And the second point, when you become dehumanized, you also become traumatized. Okay, so obviously, and these are questions where, or statements where we have answers that trauma begets violence. Okay, so if I'm traumatized, it means I'm harboring like I'm harboring hate, for an example. I'm harboring a sense of like woundedness, and obviously my head and sense of woundedness will need to be projected onto the other, and this woundedness will be projected onto the other in two ways, either to other men, because male to male violence is also a problem in this country. Okay.
Yes.
And it is gendered in nature. And then it is also projected onto women. There's a head, this woundedness. So men are perpetrators of like violence, but they're also like victims of the same like violence. So everyone is caught in this violence that men like perpetrate, both men and women. And then the third point, it's about, so obviously now, because you have this trauma, you are dehumanized, you also become alienated from who you are. You are so estranged to who you are. And I often say this, I mean, even in the book, I mean, it's like, what makes a man a man? You go to any other man, and Obaba Bundu will confirm this, will confirm this in many conversations that we've had with men. You say to a man, how do you know you're a man? Who told you that you are a man? And what makes you a man? This man may be a professor like me, may be a doctor like Baba Buntu, but it would be the most difficult question that this man had to answer. Because
yes,
I've never like thought of, because that is granted, it's given, I mean, do I really need to think about what makes me a man? And the reaction that I always get, it is that of amusement. It is that of some, when they get to know that I'm a psychologist, they start like thinking, I'm sure the psychologist needs to see another psychologist because he's asking a very stupid question. Thank you.
And something that that Professor Langa mentioned now was that the kind of masculinity and manhood we have here, present in South Africa and many other parts of Africa, is not a manhood that occurs naturally, or that is simply the sum of African cultures, but it was corrupted, diverted, twisted by colonialism and apartheid. And he also touched on something that we've experienced all the time at our Imbizos. There's a question that comes up over and over again, and that question is the question of identity. What does it mean to be a man? What makes a man a man? And he broke down so powerfully different elements that we can see. But now we want to take a generational shift, and I'm going to pass the ball to Afura Khan. The question that many women ask, the question I ask myself is, we are young. Apartheid happened, colonialism happened. But does that exonerate our behavior? At what point do we take accountability for our actions and say, yes, I might not have had a father. Yes, townships were designed to make me violent. At what point do I say, as a young Black man, that I want to be the first node, the first agent in the change of masculinity?
Good morning. Thank you, Mike. Good morning to fellow panelists. Important and complex subject. I think for me, in trying to find a simple starting point to that question would be the point where good information is introduced to young boys. Because and speaking from personal experience, my whole journey, and especially with writing, with being introduced to literature and other forms of knowledge and, academic and otherwise, I've then started realizing, had I known this at 13, at 12, when I was looking for those significant influences, my whole outlook towards my life, not even just manhood, but towards being a human being going forward, would have been completely different. I would have understood certain powers that I have, I would have understood certain privileges, contexts, and certain harms that I could cause because of what I've inherited. I could understand better what I've inherited, whether it's a complex system, whether it's values, whether it's a household that has raised me in a certain way. I think for me, it's been said that it has taken my adulthood, where I have access to that kind of information from men who are sitting with that, from books, from, with the advent of internet information age, being able to compare different experiences. And even through my writings, then I've looked at how do I try offer at least that kind of thinking or disruption to very young boys, because there are so many things that keep reinforcing this, whether it's toxic masculinity or patriarchy, every single day. Then there isn't enough counter narratives, and we almost like leave these young men to figure it out themselves. Because in the same conversations
Yes.
that I'm having with a lot of women as well, they're like, it's not our job to educate you.
Yes.
Why don't you know that for yourself? And it's a fair question, but it's also a question of privilege as well. It's easy for me because of my privilege to access certain kinds of information and start doing the self work. If I'm, just starting with the unit, I've got privilege to that information, and I'm able to surround myself with people and influences that can reinforce the change that I want to see. But somebody who, for example, is in a township and those structures are there, and that behavior is reinforced, and there's very little alternative information or forms of it starting to escape that, how do you then say, well, you should have taught yourself this, you should have known that this is toxic, you should have known that, so for me it would be how, at the point where we introduce information, at least, besides there's a lot of work to be done, but at least information at a very early age, I think gives young Black boys a better chance of starting to do the work.
And, I love that you spoke about information, and I think later on we'll come to talk about art itself and how even in the music, the movies, and much of the art produced, we reinforce these ideas, And now coming to Pupu. Pupu, you are a Black men's Imbizo champion, part of the first generation of our BMI champions. And you yourself recently spoke so articulately about your own process of transformation and shift. So in your own words, how did this happen for you? How did you actually get to a place where you are able to actually interrogate your own behavior in the way that you do? What brought you to that place?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I would say over the period, and this is, for me, has been a very recent thing. Definitely what Furkan was saying is information. And information, not so much from a perspective of the atrocities that men do, but the atrocities that I have done as a man unto women, unto other people, and how that is actually just an expression of the damage that's inside of me. And having to really engage with that has been a complex thing. But I think what has made it far more easier to access and an easier route to walk is the support of people, support of community, having conversations like here we're having at the Black Men's Imbizo. And that is a very difficult thing, and was a very difficult thing for me, because I then had to realize that my understanding of what power is absolutely broken, and my value systems are so wrong. I mean, I recently realized that I view women and I relate to women as a way of masking my own pain and suffering throughout my life. So I value them on the same level as narcotics, as alcohol, as other forms of things that I perceive to be of value that make me feel more powerful and that make me more okay in the eyes of the world. And consequently, my my treatment of women has been as such, and realizing that has been a very difficult thing. And I've been very fortunate that I've been around people who've given me access to information, but I've been around support, and I've been in situations where other men around me are calling me out on my behavior, and other men are calling themselves out. And this has given me tremendous courage to be able to do that. One of the biggest issues I've always had is speaking about what's inside of me, and speaking about the turmoil that's inside of me, and the courage that I've been able to receive from seeing other people, not just men, but women, and especially a lot of women, express what's inside of them, and express that they too have been hurt, and they too are hurting, and they too are desperately in need of healing, has been something that has assisted me in my journey and made me realize the importance of this, because the aftermath, the body count, so to say, is really, it was too high, it was too much. And getting to this place is very important, and I've been very fortunate to be able to start on this journey.
And Pupu, something you mentioned there was the ability to call yourself out. And something that there've been two strands, of kind of shift that has been mentioned, is a change in how the man sees himself, and then a change in how the man treats women. Baba, a question that I'm asked often, and it's a very important question, and everyone who asks me this question has a right to ask it, is, so while we are working on masculinity, while we are trying to develop the men, people are dying, people are getting killed. The bodies, as Pupu so eloquently articulated, the body count is ever increasing. So what must happen now, Baba? Must we try to repair the broken men? As Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to raise strong children than to repair broken men. Do we focus on the youth? What is the strategy that we apply? Do we look at our fathers, our uncles, those who came before us, and say, they're beyond repair, and focus on the young ones? Is it a broad transgenerational effort? How do we actually go about addressing this in the urgency that is needed? And I know this is a part of your daily work, so you're not just speaking from theory, but how do we go about it? Because Afura Khan mentioned it, there are a plethora of problems. It's complex, it's hard, it's deep-rooted.
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you to my co-panelists also for the light that you are shedding on the conversation. I wish there was an easy formula that I could just spit out in 4 simple points, and then we could just follow that. But I think to give some of based on my own experience and my experiencing, putting together and actually implementing solution programs, I think, and this sounds a bit elusive to say, but first of all, I think just like I would say to white people that they should actually take responsibility for dismantling racism. We know they cannot do that. We cannot trust them to do that, but they should. And in the same way, I would say to us as men, and particularly African men, that we need to take responsibility for the violence and for the destruction that some of us cause. Even if I individually feel that, but I'm not doing that, that's not really my problem, I haven't done anything, but I am, in the sense that I'm not really adding anything to a problem that affects all of us. I think it's important to place gender-based violence in our experience as African people, and I come from an understanding that our violence, our realities, our violence, our traumas, our history is different from other people's. Maybe interlinked at some points, but very different. And I think we must stop being afraid of talking about our own realities as different from others. People will accuse us of essentialism, but I think it's more about being present and being real. So first, we need to take a stand as within myself. And I think Brother Pupu gave a very good narrative to how he had internalized and come to a stand when he needs to take responsibility for, first of all, himself, but also the people that we are surrounded by, my family, my friends, people that I engage with. Am I willing to cut out a piece of my reality where I actively engage with these questions? And I think I have actually experienced this. So Shabaka is a platform where we create dialogues. We invite men into understanding themselves better through certain methods that we use. And we lean a lot on African cultural practices in doing this as well. And I find that many men who have leadership skills, who can speak confidently in front of people, who can even talk about themselves, they shiver to stand in front of an audience and say that I want to talk to you as African men. A lot of us feel that, but I can't do that. I'm not a good role model. I'm not a good enough. I don't measure up. So there's something we need to do about our own presence. And as you said, can we really afford to do, because healing work takes time. It's not something you do over a week or a month, or sometimes not even a year. So while people are dying, while people are being murdered, can we afford to do that? I think this is the challenge we live with, that we need to destroy something and we need to build something at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
The design of destruction that we all are affected by in different ways. As was said earlier in the conversation, women are being killed, men are being killed, we are being killed. There's a design that thrives on our death. And so when we just sit back and feel victimized by that, that's exactly what that design wants. And that's how that design of white supremacy and westernization becomes more powerful. So number one, we need to place a responsibility within ourselves. And some of us, we have to accept, some of us will not be willing to do that. Some are not willing to take that journey. But those of us who are must make that our vocation. As a husband, as a brother, as a broken man trying to heal and work on that. But as I'm doing that, I also need to, as I grow, take on mentorship, talk to other men, see other men as my brothers. You know, we have a unity problem across this continent, which stops us from really having the conversations and the dialogues that we need to do. So we need to, I don't want us to rush to institutionalize, because we are so flavored and marked by what Western institutionalization does. So even when we want to solve this problem, we quickly use tools that we were brainwashed to think works from a Eurocentric point of view, and we think they're going to work for us. They don't. So this is the time when we really have conversations with our healers, our traditional knowledge holders, where we expect from them, because they are actually waiting for us they want to have an impact in this process. So I think we need to do many things, but the first thing is, am I willing to do something with my time, with the little resources I have, whether I feel I do or not? But it's an individual responsibility, then it's a collective responsibility at the same time.
And you know, something that you mentioned, Baba, that is very powerful, and that you mention always, is us also having a conversation with our healers, our traditional knowledge holders, us also going back and not always looking at the Western model of how to do change and how to build a man. And I'll pass the ball to Prof. Langa now. Prof, one of the challenges we have speaking to young men is to say, okay, when looking at my culture, when looking at my religion, how do I take what I view to be good and leave what I view to be bad? Because many have mentioned that they believe, you know, elements of their culture or their religion are patriarchal, you know. And here, maybe you can speak from a psychological lens as well as from an experiential lens. When looking at identity, one of the things that identity is built around them, there must be a central element, you know. Chinua Achebe, in his book Things Fall Apart, gives a story, a narrative of an African man whose life falls apart when the things he holds central fall apart. So how do I do that interrogation of my worldviews, my cultural perspectives, my religion, my upbringing, and maybe even my heroes? And at the same time, you know, as of interrogating these things, how do I at the same time then develop myself? Because one of the things, as Pupu mentioned, is there is a fear from men. Men are afraid to break the patriarchal norms. Men are afraid to challenge the systems they've seen. They don't know what will happen afterwards. So Prof. Langa, how can we go about that in a way, like Baba says, that helps us destroy the bad and build the good?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with the analysis, but obviously, I mean, the structures and the institutions, we need to be very critical of them. You know, I guess even in terms of the messages that they propagate. And I'll give you an example based on my field work.
Yeah.
When writing this book. Culturally, we know very well that if I have impregnated like a girl, there are cultural processes or steps that need to be followed. And obviously, I mean, I guess the family of the girl will come to my household and find a way of reporting the fact that I've impregnated, their daughter. So obviously there is intlawulo that needs to be paid.
Yes.
And we have a rich data and rich history with how this practice worked, and it had a lot of meanings, including the issue of lobola and so on and so forth. But of course, we also need to acknowledge the fact that imperialism, it is also racist in nature.
Hello. Hi. Yeah.
Yes,
Hello?
feel free to continue, Prof. Langa.
Yes, it's racist in nature.
I see her name. I'm just letting her know now.
Robin, we
because
are
I hid myself. So I just want her to hide her name. You'll see there's like something that just says Zoom.
So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that our cultural practices need to be celebrated, need to be acknowledged, need to be respected. But we also need to acknowledge that at this point in time,
yes, Prof. Langa?
Okay, we need to acknowledge that some along the way are sort of becoming contaminated in this way, because in the book, I mean, there's a section on teenage fathers, and many of them, they making an argument to say, of course, I mean, I don't have money to pay this ntlawulo, and as a result of that, I'm seen as not being man enough. Okay, it's our cultural practice that we've had it for so many centuries, but obviously along the way, it is getting, I guess, misinterpreted and misread and being implemented in a wrong way. Because now, which is part of the bigger system, where everything now has become highly, highly commercialized. And now the only option that you are left with is that mfanele ngijoina majita. And mangijoina majita, zaya rounding, and then obviously it means I have to make means to have no money. And then I can be seen as a man. So obviously now the issue, which is very cultural, that value in it, it is having unintended consequences, because those that are not willing to vie to panda, to get extra cash, yes, they're not able to have access to their children. Okay, and then obviously the cycle then begins going back to what we said in our introduction about the head, about trauma, about leg, and then the cycle sort of continues. Yes. So part of this conversation in conclusion is that we cannot have this conversation about the need for men to be different, for men to be non-violent, while we are living in a violent world. And here I'm referring to the global sort of system. And its violence, the violence of the system, it is not physical, it is symbolic in nature. And now with this COVID-19, you begin to see some elements of the system for what the system is in its true sense. Okay, because there is no way men, and especially Black men, given how they are marginalized within the economic system, given how they're being treated, and still expect them to be human beings. So this conversation, in conclusion, it has to be linked with other systems because in fact the black men, besides the fact that they perpetrate so much violence, there's also a violence that is being perpetrated against them by the bigger system. And it's so sad that we are seen as a problem without seeing the system as a problem as well.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for those comments, Prof. And of course, you referenced your work very heavily. And there, articulating that when you look at the violence of the system, the violence of townships, and how men are socialized to be violent, we cannot have this conversation outside of a bigger conversation about societal reforms and we as a society changing the things that we do. But you also reference culture extensively and cultural practices and sometimes the unintended effects thereof. Now I want to pass the questions to the younger generation. When we talk about culture, when we talk about society, all of these are systems we have inherited. And we come from a generation in this country and around Africa that challenged systems that were not beneficial to the people. And here with Afura-Khan, I want to pass the ball to you and ask you a question about even art, many of the art that's imported into our country and even art that's made locally. And you see visually the sexualization of women in music, in film. And what happens is that young men are taught from their young ages watching television, the idea that a woman solely exists for their sexual pleasure and that they have a right to take. And that, of course, is part of the system that Professor Langa was referring, that the condition of the Black man is not in isolation, but is a part of an environment. Now, in the context of this environment, we might not have the ability to shift all of the societal reforms right now, but how do we start in our spaces? How do we start with the young men in our influence, in our radius? Afura-Khan, if you can help us with that.
Thank you, Mike. I think, speaking from my personal experience, for example, my father was abusive towards my mom. And my brothers and I, when we saw that, and I think you are protected to a certain extent, so up until 13, I didn't see the violence. I was protected from it. And then at 13 onwards, whether my worldview had changed or I was a little bit more aware, I started seeing it. I started seeing what it looks like on my mother. I started seeing the impact it had in the family. And even at that age, 13, 14, 15, between my brother and I, we were able to recognize the harm, and we're honest enough between ourselves to say, this is not what we want to do when we are grown up. And as much as it was a simple decision to make at that time, growing up and living up to that decision has been hard because it's something we internalized. And even when, I am provoked or whatever the reasons are that lead a man to be violent, I need to remember that decision that I made. So for me, it was part of starting the change, at least with my generation. And it's a conscious decision that my brothers and I made to say, okay, within our household, there's this one form of harm. How do we at least change that? And part of educating the other, the next generation in our family is that part of it was us exemplifying it before even saying it. So we have not been violent towards our partners, towards the people around us. Yes, we understand we have a problem with violence. We have a history of violence. When we are sitting together and something happens, literally we're the first ones to jump up and go on to, beat somebody up. But because now we've invited other people, whether through marriage and so forth, we are now as a family exemplifying the stance that we've taken, and we want to grow that. So I think for me, in the absence of big machinery to take the education, the influence of Black men and Black boys and replace it with something positive, without that machinery that comes in oneself, the work becomes then personal work. It becomes us being honest with ourselves. For example, when you raise the issue around getting a girl pregnant or a woman pregnant and then having to go through intlawulo and so forth. That process has been corrupted, but it doesn't take away the honesty that I need to bring. If that family is stopping me or through other, forms of corruption, I need to be honest enough to take responsibility, because for me, intlawulo pretty much speaks to taking responsibility for what you have done and wanting to make sure that, either you are correcting or you are being a part of this thing. So if I'm not honest enough to want to take responsibility, then I can use amalume as an excuse, and I can use everything else as an excuse to why I'm not in my child's life or why I'm not performing the role. It's the same thing for me when it comes to violence. I think without recourse, the men who are not violent are left with very little except to literally either pay for lawyers, go down to the courtrooms, shut down parliament, so that there is recourse for this violence that is killing women now. Because, women are saying, yes, behavioral change takes time, but what about the killing that is happening now?
Mhm.
So if I decide to myself that I'm not going to be violent, I'm not going to kill, because as a human being, I understand, I don't want to be killed. I want to live. I think there's certain stances we can take personally. There's certain stances that are simple to exemplify to the people around us, certain stances that become our life code and life ethos, and we live those out. And besides how do we holding other men responsible? I feel that, for example, I can do so much within a circle of 10 men. But there are other men, whether in bigger art forms, whether it's the president, who are sitting with so much bigger voices and power and infrastructure and access. How do I activate them? How do I charge them? How do I get them to understand that what they can do as well could resonate so much bigger than what I can do? Because in reality, my influence and the work and the change that I'm effecting, at least, is still small scale. It's still not enough to stop the violence now. It's still not making sure that, another woman is not getting killed tonight, especially when the cops are not arresting those men who do it, when the courts are not convicting those men who do it, then I'm left to try solve that. And how much power do I have? So I think the individual actions help us start the process, but how do we charge the other men who sit with bigger voices and bigger infrastructure? Because we really need a radical shift forward, especially when it comes to serious violence.
And Afura Khan raises an important question there, is how do we shift the bigger system? Pupu, speaking to you now, I want you to share maybe some of your experiences about trying to influence a space. You are a football coach, work with men all the time. You have now been a part of the Black Men's Imbizo for, I think, just over a year, almost 2 years. And recently, even just recently, with what has been happening, we've seen the power of how a group of people can influence their group of people. And when we speak to the reality experienced by women in this country, it is not just taking place on the streets. It is not just taking place, in alleys. It's taking place in churches, in schools, in universities, in all spaces. And as a man who has taken accountability for his space, how would you articulate that kind of influence? Because, from this conversation, a lot has been raised, and now we're kind of shifting to more, what are the solutions? And sometimes it can seem very sad. It can seem almost an impossible feat. But you and I have been able to witness, and Baba as well, so much, and Afura Khan, so much transformation in the spaces that we are in. So maybe just speak to your own personal experience, how you shifted, and then how now you are able to shift other men. Because the last month and over the last few weeks, I've seen you influence so many people through you speaking about your own male experience. And that's how we shift a nation. I do believe one citizen at a time, we the people, even if the institutions of government or influence are remaining silent.
No, absolutely. I think the biggest thing has to be, in my experiences, has been culture. Coming to the space of the Black Men in the Imbizo, not culture in the traditional sense, but culture in the form of like combined values that we have as people in a particular space, regardless of what that space is. And I feel like that space that I've come into, the Imbizo, has a culture that does not plays value, or rather devalues oppressive behavior. And I've noticed that, and in the sporting environment, we have a similar thing, is that, you know, we're also big about building cultures that promote certain ideals, and we uphold those ideals, and the culture in itself ends up upholding them. And that's important. I mean, there was a situation where we were at a game playing on a field, and we're sitting, and a female physio walked past, and one of the boys whistled at her. And I turned around and I said, "You don't treat women like that." And I had a proper go at him, and he kind of was very shook. And then he went, "It wasn't me." Then he punched the guy next to him, and then they had a little altercation among themselves. And the reality in the situation was that myself, as the person of power and that imposed the norm, and I declared officially that that is unacceptable. And they then proceeded to have a little issue among themselves to try to sort that out. Yes, they tried to renege their accountability and the responsibility of that, but that's so important, of continually holding people to those values, because, as a very wise friend of mine once said, is that culture punishes what the law can't. Unfortunately, there aren't no laws against catcalling. You look at, certain countries like the Philippines and France are actually very recent in having laws against catcalling. But the reality of that situation is that it's such a difficult thing to punish, but culture can punish that, because what culture does, it says to us, if you don't value what we value, you can't be one of us. And until we get into a place where we're able to shift what is important to us as men, where we create groups where success is very evident and progress is very evident, and the values that uphold that are that we don't treat women poorly, we don't treat people poorly, we value people differently, then that quickly becomes a very momentous thing, and it assists us to kind of meet in the middle, both with people above us coming down and also us in our own little spaces moving up toward that. Because the reality, I think, is that if I do not stand for misogynistic behavior, for abusive behavior, and even at a micro level, because that's the reality, it's not just like killing and raping, like literally catcalling, whistling, the manner in which we speak to women, the jokes that we make. If I don't stand against that, if I don't make that an unacceptable thing in my environment, then nothing will change. Because if that cultural shift doesn't happen from a micro level, from a small level, and us punishing small behaviors that lead to the behaviors that we see now that are killing women, we will never be able to get there. And this is very, very important, because there's a man, John Cow, he says the design is about moving from the existing to the preferred, and the future is a design problem. And we have to be very intentional about designing our spaces, designing our environments, and designing our cultures to move us to a place that we prefer to be. And we prefer to be in a place where we aren't killing women, where we aren't raping women, where we aren't abusing women. And we very much have to be intentional about that at a micro level as individuals with the people among us, and be brave enough to do that even when the cultural weight is not with us. When I am the smallest person in the room, that was a situation where I had the power. The reality was I could say to him, "You're not going to play." And the reality is he didn't play that day because I didn't bring him on because of that behavior. But in an environment where the power is above me, where I'm not the one who has the power to decide who gets what and who receives what, I still need to be able to be brave and still need to be able to be courageous enough to say, I'm not part of that behavior. I will not stand for that. And that's very important. And once we get to that point, we're making progress and we're getting to a better place. And we then meet our president in the middle, because he has a top down and we come from the bottom up and meet in the middle, and we change everything. We save young men with old men.
Yes. And thank you, Bubu, and articulating there, not just for yourself, but I do believe speaking for all the BMI champions. And this is where, we're landing our conversation. So I'm going to kind of allow everyone to briefly answer these questions. But I want to go to Baba here, because Baba, I've seen the men who have been a part of Shabaka. I've had the privilege of being at your home, and I've seen how you have been able to literally shift cultural norms, value systems, create safe spaces for men and women. And something that we spoke about the last time we were together, I believe it was on your radio show, was the power of family. Because in many of our conversations, and especially this conversation, which is so important because it has to do with Black lives and the lives of Black women, and each and every man, will speak to you about how he values his mother and so forth and so forth. But when we look at the value that we as men place upon our women, it is unacceptable, really unacceptable. And as I've shared with you, the audacious vision and belief that we have, that we can create a South Africa free from femicide, free from rape, free from all these places. But I've said this to you, and maybe some watching might disagree with me. I think the most powerful institution in this country is not the union buildings or Parliament in Cape Town or the Concord in Johannesburg, but the family. So Baba, if you could share with us how in family, and obviously not just talking about nuclear family, but family in the African sense of Ubuntu, that this idea that of togetherness and an intertwined destiny, how do we leverage on family to bring change?
Thank you so much. I think the way I should respond to your question, maybe to paint a picture, is to just share a little bit from my own life and experience with this, because
Yes, please.
me and my wife, we have made certain decisions about how we look at family and what we want to achieve in the space of family. And others will have to find out what they want. Many may not want what we do. But what we have done, coming from broken families, both of us, we first of all have taken time to tell each other how I need to heal, how she needs to heal, and what is my role in her healing, what is her role in my healing. Like we went back and forth, but that was the foundation of our relationship, understanding what that means as two broken Black individuals, very harmed and very broken by our multi-generational breakdowns and pain. And then we decided that we want a family that has an open door for anyone who feels drawn to the work that we do, whether that is because we also presence African spirituality, Black consciousness, Pan-African values very strongly in our home, in our work. It influences what we do outside the home, but we feel that we cannot even leave the home and talk outside unless we practice it within the walls of our home. So for us, we live with young people who come and stay with us for various periods of time, some for 6 months, some for 2 years. And that's kind of an internship. We have chosen to work particularly with young men, not because we don't want to work with young women, because we also have programs for them. But in the space of family, we have focused more on young African men. And the power of that is that I always ask this question: how many couples and relationships that are strong and have been existing for years do you know within your actual circle, that you can go and visit them and have conversations with them, that you think, wow, this is actually a relationship that I would like to model. This is a representation of what I want in my own. And you'll find that so many cannot even count more than 5 fingers, if not even that. Some get stuck at 1. So what that means is that when we come to family, which is supposed to be our stronghold as African people, because it has always been since day one, and family not just in the sense, like you said, of mother, father, child, but the elders, the children, even if the biological connection is not there, there's other people that you relate to as family. And losing that and being broke in that place, which we know apartheid and colonialism did very, very, very deeply. It's a way of bringing back power. It's a way of education. And we sit with young men, we have discussions every single day. We don't have a TV, and I think that's important to say, because we want to be our own entertainment. We want to be our own discussion channel. We want to be our own conscious and awareness space. And that doesn't mean we only have political discussions. It also means we are silly, we joke, we laugh, we sing, we play drums, we appreciate and experience culture. But the power of this is that young men gets to see a couple that is far from perfect, but that always strives to live in a certain accordance, both in respect of each other and also in respect of what we perceive to be our commonalities in culture as African people. And then they get to ask questions. Then they get to be called out and say, why do you say that? Why do you say that women should do this? Why do you say that you're looking for women who are like that? And then they get to, and I think this is actually how hard it is, because you can't just go to a couple of workshops and then change what we have been brainwashed into thinking that men should be and behave like and present for generations. So it takes time. And for us, we have found a lot of meaning in using our home as an educational space. We have workshops, we bring children in on certain Saturdays, we have homeschooling, we have events, we have conversations, we have training programs, we have counseling, we have family setups. And for us, so what we have done, we've just devoted our lives to family. It is so important to us that it's like, I would rather die than not continue to do this work, even if it's difficult financially, even if it's difficult without the resource level that we wish we had, but it's meaningful. And I want to say this as somebody who comes from an understanding and experience of life as very broken, very strange, feeling that I never really fit into the design that is presented to me. I now wake up every single day and never question, why am I alive? What's the point of life? What should I be busy with? And that's a complete different reality than what I was used to for many
Yes.
years.
Well,
So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Baba. And we have a second conversation that's going to be building up from this, and we're going to be having women also articulating their lived experience. So very quickly, just 30-second closing remarks, Prof. Langa.
Mike, I mean, look, this was like a mind-blowing, conversation, and I guess the comments from Baba Bundu now and Upupu, what he said as a coach, and African, what he said about, this is also like an individual responsibility. I'm quite moved, and yes, we may be very few, but if you had to think about what all of us have said, and the work that we do in our different sort of spaces, we are up to something good, and it's not a numbers game. There is a change that we are effecting in our little corners, in our little sort of spaces. And thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And for those of you who want to see Prof. Langa's work, you can get his book at Exclusive Books, Becoming a Man, Black Masculinities in the Township. Thank you, Prof. Langa. Afurakana, closing comments from you.
Haha, I'm muted. Gratitude for the space, to fellow panelists as well, for the knowledge. I did say at the beginning, I bring more questions than answers. I think for me, in the context and the world that we live in, especially in South Africa, men hold the power, even with the dynamics, even with the different scales of power, but we hold power. How do we use our power in the individual capacity? I think there's a lot of us doing that in our corners and spaces, and I encourage more of that. And I think for us, what is needed more now is holding the other men with more power accountable and whipping them into shape and getting them to use that power to help drive these individual efforts. Because the macro work is the people that we are bringing harm on need to see that the harm is either stopping or there is positive movement. That needs to be seen. It cannot be a philosophical thing. It cannot be a time will tell. It needs to be, and there's lots of institutions and men who hold power who can help us achieve that. And then everything else that we're doing individually will then come together. So let's call each other out, but let's also come together so that our individual efforts can sprout into a big tree.
So I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists, Dr. Bababuntu, Professor Malose Langa, Afurakan, and Pupu Muhlaba. Thank you from Ubuma Leadership, and thank you as well from Constitution Hill, our partners. We're very grateful for that. We are at the end of our first panel discussion, but what is going to take place in the next 15 minutes at 11:30, we're going to go live with our second panel discussion, which will be women speaking about their experience, about how we can liberate ourselves. And something very important that I think we can take away from this conversation is that there is change taking place, that you have agency, that you have a measure of influence. I'm speaking to you, brother, I'm speaking to you, father, uncle watching, in your surroundings to be a positive effect of change. And though we have a history riddled with colonialism, apartheid, and different challenges that have brought us to this place, you are not a slave to the past, but an active agent in writing the future. And we at the Black Men's Imbizo and all of the panelists here in their spaces are dedicating ourselves daily to the achievement of a society that is truly free, where we see women as human beings, where we see Black people as human beings, where the demons of femicide and rape and sexual abuse and all other forms of aggression against all vulnerable people are freed from our country, and where we are fully delivered to exist as human beings full of dignity and freedom. And it is a vision that seems broad, it's a vision that seems big, but as Prof. Langa said, it's not a numbers game. but we are here for the long haul and we are here for the time. So thank you for joining us, and please stay with us because we will be back shortly. So just to tell you, the next panel will be moderated by the brilliant Nonkululeko Ntambo. Will be joined by the colossal stateswoman, Dr. Mampele Rampele. We will also be joined by the incomparable Ms. Josina Machel and the intellectual force that is Ashanti Kunene. And I believe that that conversation will be a great marriage, because we as men only see a part of the picture. We don't see all the picture. And I believe that to hear women's voices after a conversation such as this will be very, very beneficial. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for being a part of our first panel discussion.
Thank you all.